Professor Lee Elliott Major, welcome to the Development by David podcast. How are you?
I'm good. I am very busy, which for the country's and world's first professor of social mobility is a good thing for me, but it's probably a bad thing for everyone else because it shows that people are very worried about social mobility, stroke social justice. So, yeah, very busy, but as ever, enjoying every moment and feeling very privileged to be in the role I am in.
Every time that I've either been on the receiving end of your talks or even presented alongside you, you're always introduced by the compere or the host as Professor Lee Elliott Major because, like you said, you're the first and only. Is that a huge responsibility to hold?
It is, and my daughter. It's always good when you have children because they bring you back down to earth. So if anyone asks, or says he's the leading thinker in social mobility, she says, "Dad, that's because you're the only professor of social mobility." Of course, and we have many great thinkers in social mobility. And indeed, the UK has many of the leading researchers in that area. But it is a responsibility because it's very much a personal passion for me as well as a professional passion, trying to basically improve prospects for people like me, who come from backgrounds that maybe didn't have as much support as others. And so I feel a real responsibility, actually. I always think of others to motivate myself. When I'm feeling a bit like I'm overwhelmed by stuff or I'm feeling a bit impostery, we can talk a bit about imposter syndrome. I try to think, I know it sounds very idealistic and cliche, but I try and think of someone like me, someone struggling, and I hope that some of my work will help other people find paths as I have done, irrespective of their background. So yeah, I do feel a real serious responsibility. I always feel sorry for my partner and my children, because I am a bit obsessive about this. I'm a bit of a workaholic.
Well, I thank you for it, Lee, and so does the world. And what I appreciate about you, and one of the main reasons that I wanted you on the podcast, is that you are contributing to this space because not only are you passionate about it, but you have walked the walk. You have got those lived experiences. A lot of people try to contribute or have contributed and don't have the insider knowledge because they haven't came from a background like yours. And your professorial career isn't your first job. You started off as a bin man. Can I ask you about that? How did that come around?
Yeah, there's a few myths associated with this story, and my old friends from school always say, "Lee, your stories seem to get bigger with every year. They seem to be sort of they get bigger, and every time you tell them." That story came around when I was interviewed by journalists, and I was a student while I was a bin man, right? So my mum worked for the local council. Bless my mum, who passed away a few years ago now. So it was nepotism that got me that job, to be honest with you. It was basically a summer job to earn money to pay off my debts. I was also a street cleaner as well, by the way, on weekends. And I always remember I spoke, if we might get into accents actually, because in those days, I come from Feltham, which is famous for its young offenders institution. It's in West London. And I talked a bit like that. I was a bit of a London boy in the 80s. My accent's completely changed. We should come back to that because I always reflect on why that's happened. But anyway, I bumped into one of my schoolmates, and I always remember this. And he'd left school. I think I was sort of in my sixth form years at this point, and he said, "Lee, I didn't realise you were going to go into this game, And I didn't tell him that I was actually a student, that I was going to go to university the next year. And to this day, I think that he probably thinks that that's the career that I went into. Do you know what? I love that job. And I honestly, I'm not joking. I made some really good friends who were a bit suspicious of me when I first joined. I was the sort of blue-eyed boy, this guy who's in education. Would he do the work? Would he collect the bags when it's raining, when you're struggling, all that stuff? But I hope I gained their respect over the weeks. And and when I left, they gave me a few presents. They used to pick up stuff from the bins, right? So you just, people throw out all sorts of stuff, you know, and they gave me a few things, presents. I remember when I left, and I got to know people. If you do a bin round, you get to know your local community, I can tell you. And I'll always remember that. Never judge people. People mostly are very kind, and they'd give us cups of tea and they would help us, and very generous people, actually, who might come from sort of very challenging backgrounds. So I love that. And I still to this day tie up bin bags in a certain way. I look at the streets to this day and I've got an urge to clean the street. I mean, it's ridiculous. So it stays with me. The story, David, I know I'm going on a bit here, but the story is important because I always use it when I give lectures to students, to sociology students, or to trainee teachers in the lectures I do, because I think it's an important talking point around social mobility. So the Daily Mail did a story on me, you know, from bin man to professor. And I'm very proud from where I come and what I've done. But you have to be careful not to just position social mobility as this kind of American dream, right? You know, someone from a poor background gets picked, becomes this amazing, you know, professor in this case. For me, social mobility, it's sort of, is this social mobility or is it social justice? I don't know. It's more the principle that your background shouldn't determine what you do, whatever that is, right? And so that means if you become a good bin man, right, that is a good service to society. If you become a social worker or a teacher, these jobs are undervalued in society. And so when I do my talks, I'm very careful not to just concentrate on that, you know, rags to riches story. I do think it's important, by the way, in that I do think it's important that we have diverse elites in our country. And I think at the moment, we suffer from having dysfunctional, detached elites. Again, we might come back to that. So it is important we have people from all backgrounds getting to those sort of top positions, however defined. But the bigger principle for me is your background shouldn't determine what you do, whatever that is. The problem we have in this country is too many people are limited actually in their choices and do not fulfill their talent, whatever that is.
I always say this when I have amazing guests on, like you. I'm playing post-it note rain with what way I want to chop and change this next flow of conversation, because I have so many different routes that I want to go down or things that I want to look back to. But I do want to kind of give a shout out to that kind of American dream style of sharing social mobility stories. I think we do play social mobility top trumps at times. We're the most drastic ones, and it discredits normal workers, people who work in middle management or apprenticeships. They are amazing social mobility stories that need to be heard as well. And I think there becomes a gratitude complex almost to those who might not have had it as bad as others, and they feel like they aren't worthy of support or a hand up. I really love that you pick up on that, and you share sentiments around that, Lee. And I also want to go back to your point around accents and how your accent has changed.
Yeah, I mean, my brother, who I don't see as much now. Yeah, we come from a split family, so I lived on my own from age 15 to 16. We're a typical fractured family. You know, mum and dad split up. Didn't really talk to each other after that. I have a sister and a brother. We're not in touch much. You know, I have quite a. I suppose some people would see it as a dysfunctional family. I think most families are dysfunctional to some extent, aren't they? But but when my brother was younger, he used to say I sounded like Tony Blair in his mind, you know, and he still retained that sort of slight London sort of twang. And I was reading about it the other day, and it made me reflect on it. I think one of the things that you do when you're an awkward climber like me, so you leave the place you come from, right? You don't ever feel quite at home back where you came from, because you've moved on, you've gone to college, you've met other people, you've become a professional, right? but you don't quite feel at home in the place you've got to. You know, I still, to this day, when I'm interviewed by people like yourself, or when I'm giving a lecture, or when I'm walking into number 10, you know, I still sometimes think, is this really me? It's like a surreal experience. You know, it's like, are they really wanting me to talk? You know, and I'm very conscious of the fact my accent has changed. The thing I was reading was suggesting that if your accent changes, it's sort of subconsciously you trying to relate, or trying to. It's about identity, really, you know, and maybe you're trying to find an identity in the new place you've got to, and maybe I do that subconsciously, and I guess I do struggle with that still to this day. You know, I say to people, social mobility is really important, but it doesn't solve the life issues. You know, I still struggle with all the things that we struggle with in life, right? You know, and again, I go back to that narrative of the American dream. The implicit assumption in all that is that, you know, the people that win the X Factor, or, you know, whatever TV show it is that their lives are then suddenly perfect in some sense. That's not true, you know. And I've met many people over the years, you know, when I was chief exec of the Sutton Trust, having to fundraise from billionaires. I've had the privilege of meeting, you know, leaders across the world in many fields. And what's kind of interesting in that is that, one, you realize that a lot of them are winging it, right? Which, you know, has been yeah, because I think when you come from, if I can quote David, from a similar background to me, I think when you start off, you think, oh, these people are so clever and they've got it so sorted. Their lives are so perfect. How can I ever possibly match that? And what I've realized is that no one is, of course, perfect. And even if you're rich and you're famous, we all suffer the same things, right? It's just, I think some of the more privileged people are able to perhaps hide some of those anxieties more. And what I would say, sorry, again, I am talking a lot here, but I think what I try and do is be honest about some of my anxieties, because I think that opens up avenues for other people to feel okay about that, right? So
So if I were to ask you, Lee, what anxieties do you have, even though you've evaded your economic background? What are the kind of the social aspects that give you anxiety?
Well, listen, you know, I've been thinking about, you know, you say the economic background, and listen, you know, I own a house now. You know, I have children, both of whom will probably go to university, right? So I am middle class on the outside, but I still have worries about money. Sometimes irrational money. Worries. I mean, you know, little things like, so I'm doing a Viva for someone in Durham University coming up next month. And the way the system works is, you know, you have to sort of pay for your travel to go up there, and then you claim back from the university. Now they will pay it back, no doubt about that. But it takes time, and I'm always slightly anxious about paying out all this money when you're coming to the end of the month, you know. Now, the truth is, for me, I'm lucky enough I can put it on the credit card, you know, and it'll be paid back. But I think because of my background, because I did have to worry about money, and I was living on my own at age 15, 16, where you know, you have to worry about every penny. I think that stays with you. I do. And one of the things that I think we need to challenge is for people from working class backgrounds, what are the assumptions in some of these middle class professions, like being a professor, like being a civil servant? I'm doing some work with some civil servants at the moment, trying to challenge some of the middle class norms in the civil service. At the same time, trying to provide a practical guide, if you're a working class civil servant, of what you need to think about, to expect, i.e., maybe having to pay for things and claiming back, maybe having to push yourself a bit more than you're used to exaggerate your achievements, all the things that you don't get told if you don't come from that sort of middle class background. So I am anxious about some things like that, and I still, some days, to be honest with you, I don't give a damn. I'm like, I'm here. I'm proud of my background. I don't care what I say. If it's legitimate, if it's authentic, and I do get, sometimes I've had, people try to stop me saying things and things like that, and I think I'm an independent. If a professor can't say it, then who is going to say it? So I'm very. Some days, honestly, I just will go for it. I really don't care. I feel like it's a sort of life mission, this. But then, to be honest, other days I really suffer from anxiety about. It's almost, again, like imposter syndrome. I've got to give this huge lecture today, or I'm doing an interview. Can I? I know it sounds odd, Dave, because we've spoken many times, and you've heard me talk many times. But honestly, sometimes behind the scenes, I will really worry about giving a presentation. What I found is, and I say this to people like yourself who are coming through, who are slightly younger than me, is I just think you've got to go with it. You've got to ride with it. Some days you're going to feel confident and you're going with it. And other days, it just hits you, and what I find is, I have got a dog now, right? Because my kid's getting older. So this is my sort of empty nest syndrome thing. You get a love it. And I walk the dog, and I know this sounds, again, so basic, but you talk to people when you've got a dog. You talk to anyone, right? And it doesn't matter who they are, what you're doing. It's very human. It's very basic. And those conversations can lift me. It's really weird, I know, but it's just that human contact, non-judging. We're all in this together, and that few of those, and I'm all right again, So
would that be because perhaps in that capacity you're Lee Elliott Major, not Professor Lee Elliott Major, and there's no pressure on you in that regard to be this great academic that's well spoken with a polished accent with a PhD. You're just Lee with the golden Labrador per se, or whatever dog you have.
Yeah, it's a black cockapoo, but
Oh.
I think you're right. Maybe it brings it down to that basic level, and I'm conscious, though, as well. Like both of us, it's interesting when I share stories with people, and I think, by the way, sharing stories is really important. Really important. And I think, when I talk to people in companies, or, when I sort of, get your network going, because, just talking about stuff is very therapeutic for all of us, and being open. I think sharing your anxieties is really important. I left home at about 15, 16. I didn't really have a proper parenting figure, really, to be honest with you. I didn't have a proper father figure. So I think, those things stay with you, don't you? They stay with you. And now I've got my own children, so I feel real I probably am over the top with my children, probably, right? You overcompensate. But it's just, human contact can really lift me in the most basic of things, and you're right, maybe it isn't associated with all that status stuff that we've been talking about.
Did you set out to have such status? The reason I asked that is because I had a billionaire on the podcast called Sir Tom Hunter, and I proposed to him this idea of the millionaire's menopause, is what I called it. He was from a working class town called New Cumnock, not many miles away from my own hometown. And I speak about this kind of hedonic desire, if you're from a lower socioeconomic background, to almost peacock and gain a high level of status because you've never had it. To beat the odds and to have it all, and then to kind of portray that back to the world in terms of materialism or title. And then you realize that that's not rich and it's not fulfilling. So then you give it all away and you go into a more servicing role. You're a better service to the communities. For example, Sir Tom Hunter gave all his money away and became the founder of the Hunter Foundation. He wants to give away his entire net worth because he realized having the Bugatti and having the Monte Carlo mansion or whatever else wasn't scratching the itch. But you had to go through that to get to that realization. Have you experienced your own level of the millionaire's menopause, Lee?
Well, it's quite different for me, of course, because I'm not obviously paid on that sort of scale. Although I'm very aware of my own privilege, right? I am in a profession. I'm very privileged to have my own voice, to do a job that I love. I mean, my God, I'm so lucky to have that.
I
Uh,
believe.
but I've worked really hard at that. What I mentioned earlier, I'm a workaholic. I literally work every day. My job is my life in many ways. Listen, I play football, I play guitar, I do my beautiful partner Siobhan. We do have time together, and my kids and that. But honestly, I think about stuff all the time, and I'm driven in that sense. But I do some now. I'm 54. I think I do try and have moments where I reflect on that a bit. Why am I sort of working so hard? I think part of it is, to be honest, being driven by that fear of being caught out, or someone tapping you on the shoulder saying, we've caught you out, Lee. Get back to that street where you were cleaning when you were 17 or whatever. Get back to that place where you're from. So I do think I probably have still got a bit of a chip on my shoulder, probably. And I feel like I'm still a bit of an outsider. And again, I know that probably sounds odd to you, because we've spoken at big events, and you and others have been very generous to me. And Lee, wrote this book that's become a sort of seminal book in this area. But I still feel like a bit of an outsider, if I'm honest with you. Now, that gives me energy, and it gives me work ethic, but I'm not sure, as you say, it fulfills that. It makes you happy in a sense, or it fulfills you in some way. You're constantly sort of got that sort of hole somewhere in your soul, if I put it that way. But I've kind of got a bit more balanced in later life, in that I do try and be with friends, be in the moment, all that stuff. But to be honest, it creeps in, even if I'm down the pub. I will put, there's where I still live in London, right? So I go to Exeter back and forth. Still live in London with the kids now. There's a lot of people, a lot of friends dads I play football with here. They're all in the creative industries, though. So, we're talking TV, we're talking music and all this stuff. And I can't resist a little sort of stab at them in the pub. Like, why is it that the creative industries are so incredibly posh still? And after a few pints, that can get quite quite sort of hot discussions often. I can't resist it.
I just want to say off the bat, thank you, Lee, for reflecting on that. Like, I think it's so solacing for the listener, especially if they're from a lower socioeconomic background, to hear the professor for social mobility talk about how he still has anxieties because of his background. If that's not solacing, I don't know what is. And I've
It
been unpicking
is,
this.
but David, I stress that. I suppose the thing that I'm realizing more and more, and I call it the sort of new model of social mobility, is that we just have to be really careful not to have what I call a deficit discourse, right? Which is looking down on people just because they happen to come from, I even don't like that term, lower socioeconomic background, a different class background, right? Someone who hasn't had as much support, who's faced other barriers in life. I still think we sort of think of mending those people, creating a middle class clone out of those people.
Yes.
I think what we need to do, of course, is make universities more inclusive, right, of people like me, so we feel a bit more comfortable in them. We need to be more reflective of our own cultures, rather than trying to convert kids into the middle class, copy. And I do think that we're still behind in that way, and I hope the next 10 years we'll get a bit more. I suppose I call it equity, really. Doing more to help people in a non-patronizing way. I still feel like, even when I talk to teachers, I do a lot of sessions with teachers, and that's all about saying to teachers, they're even teachers, we know will fight for poorer pupils. You know, they're the ones you want on your side, but even they will suffer from cognitive biases in the classroom. They will not look with the same warmth on average to kids from more working class backgrounds. So I just, sorry, a bit of a rant there, but I just think we have to be careful not to again imply that if you stay in a working class background, you're any worse than someone who's like me climbed up. Because I honestly don't think I'm any better or worse. It's a journey I've had. I was quite academic at school. If I'd been more creative or vocational, I probably wouldn't have got where I was, to be honest with you, right? I was of that right mindset that the teacher said, oh, you know, Lee can do this exercise. And I think that helped me. I think if you weren't as academically inclined as me, I think you would have suffered from my sort of background, probably more.
I really love this idea of it's almost like creating a middle class laboratory for the lower class, putting them in this lab and transforming them into something that they're not, to appease the workplace or to appease the education system. And I think one of the lowest hanging fruits to stay true to your roots is to probably to stay true to your accent. And I'm saying that as someone who gets slaggings from their mates. My flatmate who I live with, he says, David, you're using your podcast voice again, or you're using your KPMG voice again. And actually, I'll tell you a funny anecdote. We were speaking offline about how our commonality is the royal family and speaking to the Queen. And I had the opportunity to speak to her in 2020. After months and months of keeping it secretive and not telling my friends, I finally shared the video with them in this group chat, this WhatsApp group chat. And you can imagine what working class lads group chats are like. And I finally sent it to them and shared the news with them. I was expecting congratulations and confetti, but they said, David, why are you speaking like a wanker, is what they said, because I have obviously polished every sentence when speaking to the Queen.
Yeah.
That was the only validation I got from them, and it was quite a pertinent moment for me. And yeah, I think
I got, sorry to say, but butt in again, but just before I forget, when I got that OBE, which was a bizarre experience for me, going into Buckingham Palace, and I was quite sort of, I saw that as just another thing to enable me to do the job I can do. So to be honest, I do think having that OBE on my email signature helps me get introductions, probably even helps me get funding and things like that. So I saw it as a way of helping me doing the thing I can do right now. But some of my mates from school, they thought I sold out. They had thought this was, yeah, how can the Professor of Social Mobility get an award, one from the royal family, which is the epitome of non-social immobility, you know, and also for some of my black friends, they felt that this was associated with the British Empire, which had all sorts of, you know, connotations about race and all the empire. You know. So I was honestly, it wasn't a universal well done, Lee, definitely not. And the other thing, by the way, is names as well, and it's just not accents, it's names. You know, Lee is the giveaway. It's a working class name. L-E. It's like, you know, I hated my name, and I think again, these are very basic things, right? But you know, when you're in Britain, or particularly when you're in England, you walk into a room and people, I'm afraid the class system does still exist. I often get asked this. I do, because people ask you, they're making a judgment on your accent, what school you went to. I went to a comp in West London that never heard of. They've already judged you. Your name's Lee. Honestly, you could just see them, you know, looking further down their nose at you. Now, maybe that's a chip on my shoulder still. I don't know. And if I'm in my confident mood, I really don't care. If I'm in my more sensitive mood, I'm like a bit, well, you know, in defensive mode. So, but I'm still convinced that that is the case, that people still judge you before they've actually even spoken to you, right? I don't know if it's quite the same in Scotland, but certainly down south, it seems to get worse the further south you come down.
Yeah, I've noticed myself in certain social situations. So for context sake, I just moved to Glasgow from my council house in Prestwick. I escaped my dad's council house and moved to the posh end of Glasgow, which is the West End. And I've came across some new friends, just through the nature of living here and through my podcast, are very successful. Went to private school, went to Russell Group universities. Some of them are millionaires. Some of them have McLarens and supercars and everything else. But I noticed when they introduce me to other people in their circle, they don't introduce me as David. They don't introduce me as the working class lad from wherever else. They introduced me as the podcaster who spoke to a billionaire, or the guy that spoke to the Queen, because it kind of it masks and band-aids all the things that make me working class. He goes, right, because evidently these people notice by my accent or the way I dress that I'm working class, but my friends seem to band-aid it by kind of signaling to those that they're introducing me to by with these achievements.
Mm,
But
mm,
one question I had for you, Lee,
mm.
and I don't want to forget to ask it, is around, I'm not sure if it's a concept that exists already, social mobility guilt. Do you have guilt that you're very middle class now and that you have things that you never had before and those from your background typically don't have? Do you ever feel guilty for that?
I'm not sure if guilt is this the right word. I do feel like I've worked really hard for this. And honestly, I've never taken a day off work, right? I've worked hard, so but I do feel fake a bit sometimes. When I do go down the pub, and if I'm with the dog, and I do feel sometimes a bit fake. And again, I think it's more that sort of who am I? Because I am someone. I've got no family money. There's no sort of, I am who I am. That the house I'm in is all through mine and my partner's earning. We are. That is who we are, and I tell you where I don't feel fake on it, but I do try, and with younger generations, just try, as I said, trying to be open as possible about my frailties and anxieties, because I think it's so easy to look at people like me if you're young and you're seeing in a nice house in North London. Oh, this guy's fine. I try and at least sort of say, look, I went through this, without being a bit boring about my own life. I looked like a punk. I usually use that picture. I don't know if you've seen it, Dave, where
With the blonde hair?
I've got eyeliner, I've got blonde spiky hair, I've got eyeliner, big hoopy earrings. I'm not sure if I was still looking like that, would I still get into number 10? I don't know, but I do show that because I want to show young people that I did look like that at one point, that I was on the edge in many ways, clinging on in some ways. But I feel like I've worked hard for this. But, saying that, I don't judge people who haven't been able to maybe work so, because I do think I've been lucky in finding things that I really love doing, right? And I always say to young people, whether you go do an apprenticeship, whatever you do, you've got to find something, one, you're quite good at, but two, you like doing, right? And it's very easy to work hard when you love what you're doing, but no, I don't think I feel guilt. Maybe that's coming. I don't. Yeah, I just feel a bit of imposter syndrome sometimes. And there's not many people like me in my generation. Other professors, lovely people, by the way, all really nice, but most of them come from very middle class backgrounds, I found, and so they just often just don't have the same habits as me. I promise not to swear on this podcast, but you watch me on the football field still, and my younger self comes out. I'm quite an aggressive player. I always have to. I come back and Siobhan, my partner, says, "Oh my God, who have you had a fight with now? What's it?" And so all that sort of slightly sort of working class, more streetwise type of person that I was comes out in those circumstances, and it's almost like a valve for me, to be honest. And my poor mates who I play football with, honestly, I'm probably the most controversial player there because I'm shouting at people. I play on the edge, I really do, and everyone's really surprised when I tell them this, because they're like, "Lee, you're the nicest guy, the most calm guy. You give these talks." Or honestly, it's there is there is someone inside me who still has a lot of that, bit of anger, probably a bit of angst. I don't know. It's there, and I don't know whether that's part of all this is what we're talking about. Maybe there are some unresolved things. I don't know.
I treat this podcast as like the university of me. I get to speak to people who I find truly interesting and build my own curriculum around it. And I'm learning a lot from you, Lee, and I'm relating to a lot because similarly, stand-up comedy is my same vice. When you play football, I'm doing stand-up comedy. I'm very different when I'm doing that. Saying really dark humor jokes, perhaps bringing to life some of my traumas I've experienced, and swearing and cursing and being on the line. And it's a very different David to what's on this podcast today. And
Mm,
what I notice about that though is I guess it is a release valve and it is great, but wearing this kind of persona, this very polished persona, when it's given feedback, the ego is only available to receive praise and not love. Like I don't feel it the same, but when I do a stand-up comedy set, when I'm truly me, and someone says, "David, that joke about that time your mum and whatever else, like that was hilarious." I feel that because that was me on stage. But
mm,
again, using this very polished version of ourselves is also a defense mechanism when it comes to feedback, because when it's given constructive feedback or it's maybe um given negative disputes or negative commentary, then we can say, well, that wasn't truly me. I didn't truly show up to that experience or that opportunity, so I don't need to fundamentally change. And we
mm,
also use it as a defense mechanism.
mm.
Um, I really
Yeah.
love that quote that the ego is only available to see the ego is only able to see receive love, not praise.
Mm,
And I've definitely felt that. And I can hear that through your story too.
mm. I mean, I relate to that in the sense that I think I still seek external affirmation in a way that I wish I didn't. So, I do public lectures, as you know, I do media. I'm quite a media prof. I do a lot, and I also play guitar in a band when we can play. I yearn, even though honestly, if you saw me when I was 14, 15, I was absolutely petrified of speaking up in class. I was quite shy in many ways, but now, because I've done it for so many years, I'm more comfortable with that. But I'm very conscious of not getting into that trap of sort of seeking some sort of external affirmation that I'm okay in some way, right? And I just watched that, David, with your stand up, because having met some other stand up, that can be a theme, right? You're right. You have a persona, but there is also this sense of you're seeking some sort of ultimately external affirmation. On that, I'd say we got. I know it sounds very cliched, but you've got to find yourself from within yourself ultimately, right? And I think it's harder for those of us who've been on a journey. In France, I did a TV interview, and they called me trans class, which is a new one on me. I sort of said trans has got a slightly different connotation in this country, but they were fascinated by this example of someone who'd sort of come from one class and moved to another. And I do think it opens up some of these things we're talking about, who am I, and am I valued, all these sort of things that motivate us, but also do make us anxious.
And I guess if you come from perhaps a more affluent background, you have the resources to offset going into some of these industries, like the creative industry, like stand-up comedy. You get paid £10 to travel around the country to do a gig in a pub. If you're from a lower socioeconomic background, that's not feasible. But if you've
Mm,
got your parents funding you to do that whilst
mm, mm.
and you don't have to have a part-time job on the side, then of course you can go and pursue these things. But I was speaking to
Yeah.
you offline that like my mum passed away, and the whole reason I wanted to become an accountant and work in professional services was to
Mm,
gain a decent enough salary to kind of aid the hardship she was going through. So I didn't
yeah.
really have so much of a choice.
Mm,
I
mm,
had potential, but I didn't have a choice
mm.
because I needed to earn as much as possible.
Yeah.
Whereas if I had if I had a trust fund or I had loads of cash in the bank, then I would have maybe just pursued stand-up comedy or podcasting full time. And I think maybe that's the inertia that you and I have faced, that we've went down this very trusted route, this very secure route because of
Mm,
our background, because we know the importance of money and the impact of
mm,
financial fragility.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I think we live in a very unequal society. I don't think it's a level playing field. I get really frustrated when people talk about the sort of diversity work, social mobility, as if it's a kind of dumbing down of meritocracy. Actually, it's seeking out talent from wherever it comes and in whatever form it comes, right? That's what my role is really about. And often when you talk to people, I think some of these things still are hidden. The people that have done well in the creative industries are very talented, but when you sort of dig beneath the stories a little bit, you find out that they were incredibly wealthy. So they were able to spend 10 years, being an actor with support. And I totally understand that they're not going to sort of throw away all that sort of support. I totally get that. But I just think you've got to put that into context for those that don't have that wealth and support, who don't live in London, for example. So I do think it's a really one-sided race. I still think it is. And I think that's sad because there's too many people who have huge talents who do not get fulfilled, right? So yeah, I think a lot of I call it the sort of hidden rules of the game. We're not told these things, are we? That to be in certain careers, you need that security, so I need my earnings now just as much as I did when I was your age. I still got a mortgage, that ties you into a certain way, and you could be far more, I think, confident and bold if you don't have that responsibility. Wait till you have children, by the way. I do think, by the way, the other thing I'll say about all this is not so much a personal thing, but I do worry about the younger generations. And my view is that I think society is going backwards compared to previous generations. If I look at when I was a student, I was on a full grant. I did struggle a little bit with money. I did obviously work as a binman during the summer to help. And by the way, I earned more money doing that. And I remember getting a round in at the local pub, and I bought everyone a pint with that money. I was rich, But I compare myself as a student with Sheffield I was at, with students now. I think I had a better time. I worry about stories about students not being able to afford coats to wear in the winter, struggling to eat, not having a space to study for their exams. In schools that I visit, teachers telling me stories now of kids who aren't able to go to the dentist because they can't get dental treatment. Children who steal toilet rolls in the school because they don't have it at home. I mean, these are harrowing stories, right? And I just feel like, we had this narrative that we all sort of believe in, I guess, which is that things get better, that every generation, we learn more, and I don't think that's happening, sadly. I think we're going backwards. So I really hope that my work I can pass on the baton to people like yourself, because I think it's going to be your generations. Even you're getting a bit old now, but it's going to be the younger generations who are going to have to fight for social justice in a way that they are fighting for other things like environment and Black Lives Matter, all this stuff. I think this has to be one of the big societal issues. Otherwise, in my view, it's all going to unravel, because you're going to have people who come from my sort of background who aren't going to have the chance, and ultimately, if you have enough generations of that, I think people are going to say, I've had enough. What has modern capitalism done for me? So we're living in very interesting times. So I just hope I can sort of contribute to trying to challenge some of those things that are not spoken about.
Why do you think, especially through media, the spotlight hasn't been shone on social mobility in comparison to other societal causes? I guess perhaps racial equality has been exacerbated by BLM and George Floyd, things that have happened in time. Same with LGBTQI plus rights with Stonewall. Do you think it's because there's not been a significant media popularized event. Do you think that's why we haven't had the light shone on social mobility? I mean, we did have Grenfell per se, but we've never really had a kind of universal, worldwide.
Yeah, it's hard to know
issue.
what that event would be, but it is interesting, isn't it? It does tend to be events that trigger something, even though that issue was there to begin with, right? And I always get frustrated with that it takes an event in itself to sort of make something happen, a terrible event. I've thought about that a lot. What would it take, you know, to make something like this more of a sort of mainstream issue? I'm not sure if it will be that, but you know, I just think that there will be increasing numbers of people who are thinking, "What's in this for me?" Right? I've got no chance whatsoever. I think the other problem is if we talk about class. You know, we talked about class a lot, and you know how you define that is interesting. You know, what does it mean to be working class? It's less obvious maybe than other characteristics. So you know,
Yeah.
and by the way, you know, social class affects everyone, you know, whether you're male, female, black or white or whatever, you know, it is there for everyone. And so I don't like the sort of idea that, you know, you can't have these things are all interrelated, right? And ultimately, you know, when I do sessions with teachers, we talk about how you need to think of pupils as unique individuals. I know that, again, that sounds so obvious, but we are all products of our class, where we come from, some of the attributes we might have if we are on the spectrum in some way. We have lots in common, right? We have lots of things in common, but we're all unique. And so you have to be careful, I think, with those sort of labels. But I think social class is maybe not as obvious, right? And maybe it's more complex than some of these other things. But it's so important, David. If you look at all the studies, they keep coming back to this, you know, that if you come from a certain household where mum and dad were trying to balance, you know, many jobs, part-time jobs, poorly paid jobs now, it's harder for them to support their children when you've got other children being cultivated, being privately tutored, being primed to succeed in school, right? That's what you're up against. And I think that, you know, unless we do up our game, I think there's going to be bigger divides, actually, in fact, in family upbringing, which leads to greater school divides, which leads to probably lower social mobility for future generations. Sorry, I'm really depressing you now, aren't I? But I
But you're
do
correct.
worry, yeah, about
Where there's winners, there's losers. But if I were to kind of end the podcast on a kind of pragmatic high note, if there's someone just like us who are in their teens and thinking, well, I relate to a lot of David and Lee's story, and I come from a very similar but perhaps different background. I understand there's a lot of things that are out with my control that I have no agency over, but there are going to be some things that I do have agentic control over. How would you give them advice, or what advice would you give them to grease the wheels of their own social mobility per se?
So listen, I think about this stuff a lot, and I do think, in my case and in many people's cases, we are our own. We limit ourselves. We think, oh, I won't approach that person because they won't talk to me. I won't try and go for that job because I'll never have a chance. I know it sounds so idealistic, but I really think if you've got enough confidence in yourself, you can get to do things. I really believe that. And so I look back on my own life, and I think I probably did limit myself in not going for things at certain points in my career. I've been very lucky that other people have helped me, you know, at key points. And I would seek help, by the way, in the sense of not sort of help in the medical sense, but yeah, other people like me who've been through it. I would go out and say, look, will you help me? And I'd be persistent on that, you know. Now, go and ask. You can only be told no. And it amazes me how many doors can open from just literally going out there and being confident and asking for things. So that would be my main advice, actually. I think also just know the game. And what do I mean by that? When I was chief exec of the Sutton Trust, I always said to my colleagues, many of whom were female as well, there's a male-female thing going on here, who didn't ask for pay raises or didn't pay rises or didn't go for the jobs or didn't hassle and were a bit embarrassed by putting themselves forward. I can tell you there were loads of people from more privileged backgrounds who were unashamedly putting themselves forward. Have no shame in putting yourselves forward. Of course, you don't want to be over the top. You don't want to come over as arrogant. But if you're polite and respectful, I think you can be unashamed in your aspirations. I honestly believe that. All the other people that I've met have been successful. Honestly, they suffer from all sorts of anxieties, but they've just gone for it, really, and they've had the upbringing to be able to do that. I think it's harder if you don't have that, but I still think you can do it. I really do.
What a way to finish the podcast, Leah. I really do appreciate your time. And just to kind of bring that last sentiment to life, I was scared approaching you, Lee, to ask you on the podcast. And despite the listeners thinking, oh, they've got on really well for the last 50 minutes or so, like I was still nervous approaching you, but I didn't. And this podcast wouldn't have happened. This episode wouldn't be out if I didn't do that. And the worst thing you could have said is no.
It's very true. And it's funny, David, because you come over to me as incredibly confident, as we were saying just before we did this, and impressive, by the way. I'm like, to be honest, I'm slightly intimidated by you because I'm thinking he's so young and yet he's already, we've done a few panel debates together and I'm like, wow, if I was that confident then, what could I have done? So I do think we probably both have a facade, a confident sort of thing that we have to use to sort of protect ourselves. But we also, I think both of us have to divulge our inner selves so that other people can see our true selves. So you've got to do that. I think that would be my advice to you as well.
I'll take it away as homework, I promise. If I were to signpost the listeners to you or your work, if they want to connect with you, where's the best place that they can do that?
So if you want to see one of my talks, there is a TED talk, which is all about that unlevel playing field. That was a few years back, and you can find that on the website. My profile is on, various on the University Exeter website. I think I've even got a wiki page these days. I've really made it. I'm on wiki, so you can find me very easily. There's loads of clips of my talks. I'm talking all the time, by the way. I do public lectures all around the country. And by the way, if someone wants me to come, if I can find the time, I'll come and give a talk. I'm very conscious of this. I met some lovely people from Blackpool. Blackpool has some of the lowest social mobility rates in England. And I still haven't done this, to be honest with you, but I said to them, I'll come to Blackpool to give a lecture, right? It's so easy to give the lectures in London and Manchester and Edinburgh, these sort of places. And one of the challenges for the social mobility debate, I think, is that we do it with the people that we're trying to help, right? One final story on this, Dave, and I will let you go. I was in a pub in I think it was Lanzarote with my family, and it was one of those Irish pubs. My partner's Irish, so we end up in the Irish pub, and they had this amazing guy who's singing on the guitar, and then he does this, and I always feel embarrassed when they do it. Oh, tell me your job, in the audience. Tell me who have we got in the pub, tell me your job. Of course, I was the only professor in there, of course. And my daughter said, oh, he's a professor of social mobility. And this guy, being a very talented guy, was saying to him, what is a professor of social mobility? And then someone next to me said, oh, he's an expert in vehicles for older people, right? This was sort of mobility. So it made me realize that you and I are in this slight bubble, actually, and there's more of us now, right, than there was 10 years ago. But I do think we need to think about how do we get out of that bubble to the people out there who this term is a technical term to them, right? So that was quite humbling for me, because I was thinking, right, I do all this good stuff, but am I really talking to people outside of our little bubbles? And I hope this podcast will get us out of some of those bubbles. But yeah, that was a really humbling moment for me.
I relate to that hugely. It's why this podcast exists, because people like us at the age of 14, 15, 16, they're not on LinkedIn, they're not reading research papers, they are on TikTok, they're on social media. So I'm glad that you could come on, Lee, and be a vessel for that information on these kind of untraditional new coming platforms. I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure, he says in a posh accent.
Oh, what a way to end it.